Good day and greetings from Pretoria, South Africa. My name is Dr. Charles Cotter. I'm the Learning Navigator, the Change Management and Leadership in a Crisis online learning program, part of the e-learning series. This is an on-demand learning program and comprises of 6 modules. Each of the registered learners will receive a SlideShare presentation per module, and then also a detailed workbook which comprises the content, but also a series of learning activities, which I'll expect you to complete at the end of each of these modules. I think this is probably the best way of continuing the engagement and also to stimulate discussion between the Learning Navigator and the registered learners. As a form of introduction, I'd like to give you a quick overview of my professional pedigree. Essentially, I've been in the field of education, training, and development for the last 19 years. Of those 19, 15 as an independent contractor. I've been very privileged to have worked for over 140 different companies, both in the public and private sector. And of course, this stretches across 18 different countries and 4 different continents. My area of subject matter expertise is strategic management, change management, and also strategic human resources management. If I could look at the learning agenda for Module 4, the key learning outcomes, we're going to shift focus and start to look at the organizational perspective of change management. So we're going to review a couple of organizational models in that regard. In particular, we need to turn the clock back historically and start off with that of Lewin, dating back to the 1950s, and his 3-phase approach to change management processes. We're also going to look at John Cotter. He suggests an 8-step change management process. We're going to systematically unpack that. And then also from an organizational behavior perspective, we're going to contrast the 7-step organizational change management process. A more contemporary approach to change management is proposed by that of ProSci. As I've mentioned with previous modules, they're regarded as a global research thought leaders with change management, and their research intelligence has enabled them to generate a 3-step model. And also we're going to unpack the ADCOM model, which is a toolkit that they provide, which will enable change managers and leaders, in particular during a time of crisis, to effectively implement and manage change to achieve the change objectives. We're also going to conclude Module 4 by looking at Case Study 2, which is then a case study which is set in Australia, Western Australia, in the mining industry. And we're going to look at how, again, working with an external consultant, one of the mining houses was able to successfully implement their change management during a time of high crisis and high pressure. Let's get started with Module 4. Perhaps I could start off this module with a quote, and this is as a precursor to Lewin's 3-step model to change management process. You'll see step 1 is then ensuring that organizational employees are ready for change. And we have said in previous modules that in order to enable this future fitness, this heightened state of readiness to embark on a change journey, probably there's 2 critical core competencies that we need to master. First of all, agility, and the one that this quote focuses on is resilience. I'm going to read the quote to you, and then I want to check again with you whether you agree or disagree with the quote, and you're welcome to drop me an email as to whether you support or challenge this particular quotation. This was a quote that I made earlier on in January 2020 at one of my training assignments. In the face of adversity, resilience is the gateway to an iron-willed inner strength that unlocks a treasure trove of personal and professional rewards, and also the rite of passage from submission to recognition. I'll repeat that: from submission to recognition, from despair to repair, and ultimately from trauma to triumph. I think this just amplifies the importance of building this change hardiness, this resilience that we spoke to about early on in this program, and in particular during a time of crisis where this particular competency is such a valuable asset for organizational change leadership teams. As I mentioned, the first organizational change management module that we're going to look at is that of Lewin's, dating back to the 1950s, the 3-phase model of change. And it's almost become an evergreen model to change management processes. And you see all the subsequent change management modules that we're going to look at follow a very similar approach. Basically, Lewin said that there are three stages: the unfreezing, the movement or the transition, the change, the transformation, etc., towards a desired end state. Then, of course, the refreezing of that particular change management project or intervention. So let's look at each one of these three phases in greater detail. So the first phase, as I've alluded to, essentially is a preparatory phase in which you ensure that employees are ready for change. And we did say it earlier on in this program, the managerial techniques, Kotter's managerial techniques to break down resistance to change. Essentially, education and communication is very important during this phase of change. This resilience that we spoke about earlier on, building the agility, building the future fitness, and ultimately from an organizational strategic perspective, ensuring that your organizational business model is future proof. Once you've unpacked and unfrozen the status quo and you start moving towards a desired end state, this is where you start executing. So again, the difference between strategic intention and strategic execution is very important. So this is where we start implementing the change management processes. We have already by now defined our roadmap, our blueprint for the change management process. And this is really where the rubber meets the road. Once we've achieved the change management objectives, we then have to make sure that there's a permanency, that the change does indeed stick, that the change is indeed sustainable. And of course, this enables us to refreeze. And you'll see very shortly, the next slide, in fact, that I share, it goes into ensuring that we can create the sustainability for this change management process. The sustainability that we're referring to is often indicated by what we call organizational effectiveness. And one of the more significant models to enable us to measure the effectiveness of organizational change is what we call the 7S model of McKinsey. And you'll see right at the middle of the model, of course, is shared values. And I think we said it earlier on in this learning program that the collection of shared values equals the organizational culture. And this is one of the most critical success factors to change effectiveness. So it all starts with the core values. And of course, building the company around those core values. That's essentially what organizational development and behavioral specialists will focus on. And this is essentially at the heart of change management. And you'll see also when we looked at case study 1 earlier in this program, and with this particular module, when we look at module or case study 2, you'll see that this is very central to all the change management programs and also ultimately the success of the change management programs. So once we've built the foundation on shared values, we then need to look at strategy, and that's the second S. We spoke also earlier on in this program about the importance of building a good structure, also having a look at the skills, the staff, and also the systems and the style. And I think the style in particular, we spoke earlier on in module 2 about the different change management and leadership styles, your processes and systems, which are very important, especially your key decisions which can improve the efficiencies and effectiveness of the organization. And of course, your technological systems, your business intelligence systems, these are very important systems. And later on in this program, in particular, when we look at module 5 and 6, we're going to focus more on the people and talent management components, the staff components, to make sure that they are sufficiently capable and competent to implement the change effectively, and of course have the right skills in the right time at the right place to ensure that the organization is effective in achieving its successful change management objectives. So the second model that we're going to look at with regards to organizational change management, probably if we had to put a time frame on this dates to the mid to the late 1990s. John Cotter from Harvard University. And in fact, I have 2 slides to illustrate this. You'll see they suggest an 8-step process, which could be seen as a waterfall, which is a current slide, a current illustration, or it could be regarded as a linear, a graduated process. So basically, the terminology is very similar. We're just going to look at the key steps, and you'll see collectively the first 3 of the 8 steps can be clustered together as preparation. This is very important. This is foundational. And in fact, if we have to dissect it and look at the very first step, it's number one, to create a sense of urgency. Cotter spoke about this with these managerial techniques on how to reduce resistance to change. And if we don't create the sense of urgency, if you don't create a powerful and compelling business case for the need and the value for change, what's in it for me, I think you'll find that there are heightened levels of organizational resistance to change. We also said that step number two is then to create a very powerful coalition. So the opinion leaders, the influencers within the organization, your middle management, your top management. We said this with module one with the ProSci research, very clear that these are critical success factors. The powerful coalition, which can create this critical mass for the implementation of change. And then no change management journey can start without the vision for change. So this is the desired end state. And like Lewin said, we have to then bridge through this transformation. We have to bridge the gap between the status quo and then also the desired end state. So you can almost regard steps 1, 2, and 3, the preparation of the stages, as foundational, very important. And this, of course, unlocks the potential for the implementation, which collectively is regarded steps 4, 5, and 6. You can see the communication of that vision. You'll see later on, I've got the 7 E's of the change leadership process, and you'll see this communication is very important, that we as change leaders are able to articulate this vision in a very compelling and attractive manner, especially during a time of a crisis. You'll agree with me, there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of clutter, there's a lot of potential barriers to the effective implementation. And if we don't have this clear and rational voice articulating this change vision, I think it becomes a recipe for disaster. Similar to what we said earlier on, your force field analysis, you have to look at what are the driving forces, what are the constraints, what are the resisting forces to change, and whatever these obstacles are, whatever these barriers are, you need, number one, to identify them, and secondly, you need to implement strategies on how to remove and to pave the way forward for the effective implementation of the change management program. Kotter is world renowned for talking about creating this milestone approach to change management, creating these small victories, short-term wins. And of course, this is very good for motivation. We're going to talk about that during module 5 and 6 in particular, with the talented people management, productivity levels, sustainability of the change management momentum, which you would have created by now during the implementation of the first 5 steps. It's very important that you're able to sustain that impetus and keep the momentum going. I think once the honeymoon phase of change is over, I think it becomes very instrumental that change leaders become the drivers and the agents of change. Initially, the advocates and the ambassadors of change, but then ultimately at this point, step number 6, also then becoming the drivers of change. I think that's very important. And then, of course, step number 7 and 8 is the management of change. And you'll immediately recognize a very clear correlation between Kotter's 8 steps and Lewin's process. You'll recall Lewin was the unfreezing, the movement, the change, of course, and then, of course, the refreezing. So I think you'll agree with me and recognize that Kotter's change management journey is very similar. The preparation, which can be regarded as equivalent to the unfreezing, the implementation, which is the actual change movement, and of course, the refreezing can be regarded as the management. So you'll see in steps 7 and 8, Kotter suggests that we initially build on this change. We look at escalating. Maybe we started off with a pilot program, and of course we've achieved that short-term win. Now we need to scale it up, we need to escalate it, maybe roll out the change management program to a larger scale change management platform or arena. I think this is very important. And then similar to what Lewin says about the refreezing, embedding of change in the organizational culture. And like we said, in reference to McKinsey's 7S model, these shared values are very important, which are central to organizational change. And if you don't embed this change into your core organizational value system, then I'm afraid to say the permanency, the stickability, the sustainability of the change will be severely jeopardized. So this is a similar illustration using the same 8 steps, slightly different terminology, but this is then the transformational path, again, that Kotter suggests. So it's the very same model. And of course, again, you'll recognize some of the terminology initially, foundationally, creating the sense of urgency, looking at creating the vision, spreading this, making it almost viral, making it contagious, trying to get this critical mass. Then, of course, step 5, you'll see, is the midpoint of this process. And it's very important at this stage that you really activate as much of the implementation impetus as possible. And then, of course, this enables you to start capitalizing on those initial gains as you graduate, as you climb this ladder almost through the implementation and ultimately getting to the pinnacle of change. And that's, of course, the effectiveness of the change management process. You'll recall with module 1, we did say that the change performance track record, the success of change management programs is severely compromised, as low as 30%. So I think whether we follow the 8-step process of John Cotter or we go old school and we follow the model of Lewin, I think it's very important that we use either of these blueprints. And in fact, when we tackle the learning activity, I think I'd like you to look at these models. I'd like you to evaluate the relative and respective merits of these models and indicate which of these models is most suitable and most relevant in your organization. And obviously, just to elaborate on why you particularly favor one model. Another model that I'd like to share with you is more from an organizational behavior and development perspective. And this suggests that there are a 7-step process map that has to be followed. And you'll see it builds. It's almost like, starting off and then plugging in the subsequent steps as we advance through this change management process. So you'll see step number 1 is to identify the forces for change. And we did talk about this earlier on with module 1, in fact, where we typically use some of our commonly used tools like your SWOT analysis, like your pestle analysis, looking initially internally, what are the strengths and weaknesses, externally, what are the opportunities and threats. And I'm going to come back to this slide, but you'll see it's very clear here that we start off with a change vision. We have to look at the mission. We have to look at the enablers, the drivers of change. We have to look at the obstacles or barriers to change. What are the core values which we can then capitalize on? And all of this then gets formulated into your change management strategy, the blueprint that you will use. And of course, like I've mentioned, we've got to look at this holistically. So we can't just look at it from an internal perspective. We've got to look at it from an external perspective, look at the market environment, not just the micro environment, look at the macro environment, also populating the SWOT analysis and using the matching strategy to develop the most effective change management strategies. So that's essentially step 1, where we look at what are these forces, both internally and externally, that are driving the need for change. Step number 1 then has an effect on step number 2, because with step number 2, we have to start formulating the performance outcomes. And this is at a multi-dimensional level. So we need to do this at an individual, also at a business unit, at a team level, and then ultimately escalate it up to an organizational level. I think if organizations that are using the Balanced Business Scorecard, they would find this particular model particularly useful, because it ties up very nicely with some of the scorecard terminology, where we look at the 4 different dimensions of the balanced scorecard. We've got to look at it from the operational perspective. We've got to look at it from learning, innovation, and growth. We've got to look at it from a customer perspective, but we also got to look at it from a financial perspective. And we often use the OTMI terminology with the balanced scorecard, and that is to look at the objectives, the targets, the measures, and also the initiatives. And once we have this broad mindset, this conceptual thinking mindset, applying, again, as I said previously in this module, systems thinking approaches, I think it makes it very comprehensive, and it makes it a very thorough perspective that we are considering the change management from looking at all the possible variables, looking at all the possible influencing factors, all the barriers and obstacles. I think this is a very comprehensive perspective of change management process. Once we've completed step number 2, that then encourages the diagnosis of the problem. This is where we have to do a proper root cause analysis. Alternative tools that you could use here are often what we call fishbone diagram, Ishikawa diagram, which is nothing more than a cause and effect analysis where you can thoroughly diagnose the problem. You look at it from multiple perspectives, and of course, this leads us, this thorough diagnosis of this problem leads us to the selection of the appropriate intervention. And yes, very important, like we said with module 1, that we start looking at the different perspectives, the spots that we mentioned previously, looking at your structure, looking at your products and services, looking at the organizational culture, looking at technology, looking at ultimately your strategy. And of course, this is very important that we apply the right interventions. Very challenging to implement change management strategies on all 5 of those planes, in all 5 of those areas. Maybe not a smart strategy, maybe selecting 2 or 3 of the most critical and then rolling it out and comprehensively within maybe a 3-year cycle, covering all of those bases. This, of course, then leads us to the limiting conditions. I have mentioned this previously, and I think probably the best tool that you could use here is a force field analysis. Very straightforward. You'll see it's very well illustrated, just looking at the driving, the positive forces for change. Again, this is based on the work of Lewin, and of course, reconciling that with the restraining forces. And of course, this will lead you to a conclusion as to whether the organization is in a state of readiness. So you've done the proper diagnosis, you've done the analysis, you're now at a very pivotal position where you can make an informed decision and maybe sometimes even take a bit of a calculated risk and constantly be mindful of the fact that hopefully the driving forces do outweigh the constraining forces. Then, of course, step number 6 is the selection and the implementation of a method. I think a good change management project plan, very important here, the timing, the scope. So we often call this your change agenda or your change terms of reference. So this is the mandate that the change management and leadership team has. I think you'll agree with me, during a time of crisis, you have to very seamlessly, very swiftly, very efficiently move through these processes. You don't have a lot of time. You have to be extremely agile. You have to be vigilant. And you, of course, have to look at the lag time and trying to reduce that as much as possible. We said it earlier on with module 1, the waves of change have become so rapid, the whitewater rapids metaphor that we mentioned. So therefore, it's very imperative that we stay focused and we are agile in our response, and we don't react, but we do indeed respond, especially during a time of crisis. Step number 7, like all good managed processes, will conclude by then looking at the evaluation, getting some sort of performance intelligence, getting feedback, making the revisions. And I think those of you that know a bit about management, the old school control cycle, where we've got our performance outcomes, we collect performance intelligence, we measure, that becomes the yardstick against which we measure it. Again, that's why the balanced scorecard is such a useful tool, because it not only creates that cascading effect, it looks at it from multiple perspectives, and we can see a clear linkage and synergy between the individual, the team, and ultimately the organizational change management scorecard. And of course, where there is success, we need to reinforce, we need to validate that particular success. And of course, where there is shortages, where there's a gap between the performance outcomes, the objectives that you set at the initiation of the change management process, and of course, what the performance intelligence, dashboarding, I think is another very useful tool that you could use, because it gives you almost a real-time performance intelligence. It gives you a very valuable analytic that you can use, and you can be very proactive in the implementation of any kind of remedial action that needs to be taken if there are deviations. It could be schedule variances, so time could be an issue. It could be cost variances. And I think, again, we can borrow a bit from project management methodology and the toolkit here. When we apply change management, we can use value-based measurement. We can use these metrics to make sure that the change management process is effective. And I think, again, we can use the McKinsey 7S framework as a means of determining the effectiveness of the change management process. So throughout this process, you'll see that change leadership is very important. And we did mention this in particular during module 2, where we said that change management and leadership is very important. And whether we apply Kurt Lewin's 3-step process, we apply John Cotter's 8-step change management process, or we apply the one that we've just navigated through, the 7-step organizational behavioral process and approach to change management, the one consistent variable is always going to be change leadership. And during a time of crisis, I don't think we can overstate the importance and the value of change leadership. So what I'm suggesting is a model that I developed in 2017, and I call it the 7 E's of the change leadership process. I'm just going to run through it very quickly. I think you'll agree with me, I've mentioned this repeatedly, that all change does start with the vision. The genesis of change management is the vision. So as a change leader, you need to create this vision. And the corresponding E that I'm talking about, the first of the 7 E's, is we need to be enlightened. If we are not enlightened, and like I said previously, we don't apply good conceptual thinking skills, good systems thinking skills, good design thinking skills, I don't think the change management process will be successful. The second E that we're looking at is eloquence. We need to be eloquent as change leaders in articulating this change message, the change vision that has to be bought. And if we don't create that sense of ownership, if we don't create that sense of commitment, if there's no buy-in from the critical mass within the organization, then the best change management strategies are also doomed to fail. We also need to be an engager, and that's the third E. So this is where leaders in particular exercise their positive and constructive influence. If you had to ask me to define change leadership in one word, that would be my choice of word: influence. Everything is about influence. If we as change leaders don't have the ability to cut through this noise and to influence people positively and constructively, like we said with the previous quote, we have to energize and not polarize. I think that's very important. And in fact, with the next module, module 5, we're going to spend quite a bit of time looking at engagement, change engagement, the strategies. Various experts, Gallup, who are the global research thought leader when it comes to employee engagement. We're going to look at the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development. We're going to look at Deloitte Perspective, Dale Carnegie. We're going to look at a whole host of different expert and thought leaders. And we're going to look at what are the most appropriate change management strategies, even throwing a bit of research from the Harvard Business Review. We'll get to that with module 5. The fourth E then is the encourager, and we did say it especially to break down the resistance to change, especially as employees transition through the different emotional and psychological states. This is very important. We need to guide them. We need to motivate them. We need to support them. We said it with the change transition cycle, the depression trough. Employee wellness programs, again, need to be on point. If they're not on point, it makes it very difficult to actualize the change management vision. We then also need to energize. We said it in particular during module 2, the important role of leadership. We spoke about the hybrid of using both a combination, a blend of both internal and external change agents. So energy is very important, especially approaching the midpoint of the change management process. you've built some momentum, to sustain that momentum and keep it going through. If you use Kotter's model, steps 6, 7, and 8, ultimately to get to the climax of the change management process, is very important that you constantly sustain high levels of change management energy. We also need to empower, and again, when we start looking at module 5 and 6, we're going to spend a lot of time on the developmental side, learning and development. I've mentioned previously on this module how to create this high impact learning organizational culture, which is very important. And this is what change leaders do exceptionally well. They've got the leaders' ability to empower, and I think that's very important. And of course, maybe it's one often neglected. The 7th and final E is, of course, ethical, and you need to be exemplary, you need to be a role model, and you need to practice what you preach. And I think we need to lead from the front. And you'll remember from module 2, again, we did contrast transactional change leadership from transformational leadership, and we did make the point that transformational leadership from the front, not necessarily being the cheerleader, but also just getting your people through the difficult and the challenging patches of the change management process, because we'll all agree that there's no single change management strategy that works plain sailing, that runs like clockwork, that runs without any problems or challenges. There's always going to be hiccups and issues and serious challenges, and our ability to maintain our integrity. You'll recall earlier in this module, I did talk about the credibility formula. Credibility equals integrity plus expertise. So I think as a leader, people look up for guidance, and I think it's very important that you provide this in a high ethical kind of moral way. So you'll recall, if you work through module 4, workbook 4, I'd like you to tackle learning activity 9, which you'll see comprises of a number of questions. So just to run through each of these questions, first of all, I'd like you to look at Kurt Lewin's change management methodology. Again, I'd like you to look at the viability, the feasibility, sustainability. Is there a business case for this old school model for change at your organization? And I'd like you to justify your response. And then I've given you a choice. You could either do question 9.2 or 9.3. You don't necessarily have to do both. And I'd like you to look at the 8-step process of Kotter, and I'd like you to compare that with the 7-step organizational behavioral change management process. I've taken you through both of those models, the 8-step model, the 7-step model, and I'd like you to select which one you think is the most relevant and the most applicable in your organization. And then, of course, give me an indication of why you favor that particular model. I'd also like you then to look at Kotter 7 E's of change leadership. So enlightened, energizing, encouraging, engaging, etc. I'd like you to work through that. And during a time of crisis, I would like you to unpack each of those 7 E's and provide 1 or 2 practical work-related examples of, during a change process, how you can apply, how you should apply each of the 7 E's as part of your change leadership role. So collectively, I think this will be about a 5 to 6 page essay, and I'd like you to respond to that. And of course, you can then send me an email, and then I think that'll be a very good way of continuing this learning engagement. So that brings a conclusion to outcome 1 of module 4.
This is Charles Cotter signing out. I'd like to thank you for watching the video clip, Change Management and Leadership in a Crisis online learning program. Please be on the lookout for subsequent uploads on my YouTube learning channel of the other modules. Also, please have a look at the chat box section. You'll see in the comment section. If you'd like to access a copy of the workbook in PDF format, I'll gladly email that to you. for this specific module, but also the other modules of the various video clips. I'd also like to remind you to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please press the notification bell to be alerted of the subsequent uploads of the other modules, and also like to encourage you to reach out and contact me. My contact details and social media presence will be provided on the screen very shortly, so I'd encourage you to reach out. And of course, I would welcome any sort of communication or feedback regarding this video clip or any other learning content on my YouTube learning channel. Thank you. I appreciate your ongoing interest and active social media support. Thank you. You keep well. Bye-bye.